Thomas had saved for years to afford his first home in Willow Creek Estates. After closing on the modest ranch-style house with the spacious driveway, he spent his first weekend moving in and introducing himself to neighbors. Most were welcoming, except for Marjorie Hoffman, the HOA president, who merely handed him a thick binder of community guidelines and reminded him about the monthly dues. Thomas noticed how she seemed to scrutinize his property even as she spoke, her eyes lingering on his freshly paved driveway. "That's a lovely spot you have there," Marjorie commented, gesturing toward the wide, curved driveway that wrapped around the small garden island. "Perfect for community gatherings." Thomas laughed politely, assuming she was making small talk. He had no idea those words would come back to haunt him. The driveway had been one of the main selling points for Thomas. Unlike most of the cookie-cutter homes in the development, his property featured a unique horseshoe-shaped driveway that created a generous space in front of the house. The previous owners had installed a small but elegant garden island in the center, with a stone bird bath and carefully selected perennials. Thomas had immediately envisioned parking his car there, maybe adding a basketball hoop at one end, and perhaps even washing his car on weekends without blocking access to the garage. Later that evening, as Thomas unpacked boxes in his living room, he flipped through the HOA binder Marjorie had given him. The rules seemed standard, if somewhat strict. Guidelines on approved paint colors, lawn maintenance requirements, holiday decoration restrictions, and rules about garbage bins. Nothing seemed particularly unusual, though he noted the substantial fines for violations. There was nothing about driveways being communal spaces. Over the next few days, Thomas settled into a routine. He commuted to his job as a software developer at a company downtown, returning home each evening to continue unpacking and arranging his new space. He noticed Marjorie walking past his house several times, clipboard in hand, pausing to make notes while looking at his property. Once she measured the height of his mailbox with a tape measure. Though odd, Thomas chalked it up to typical HOA thoroughness. On Thursday evening, Thomas was planting some new flowers in the center island of his driveway when an elderly couple stopped to chat. "You're making some nice improvements," the man said kindly, "though you might want to check with Marjorie before changing anything in the community areas." "Community areas?" Thomas questioned, looking around his private property. "Oh, you know," the woman added, gesturing vaguely at his driveway. "The spaces we all share. Marjorie is very particular about those." "This is my driveway," Thomas clarified gently. "It's part of my property." The couple exchanged a look. "Well, that's not how it's been," the man said with a shrug. "Just giving you a friendly heads up. Marjorie can be persistent when it comes to the rules." They continued their walk, leaving Thomas perplexed. That night, he double-checked his property deed, confirming what he already knew. The entire driveway, including the center island, was indeed his private property. He considered speaking to Marjorie about the confusion, but decided it wasn't worth creating potential tension with the HOA president over what was probably just a misunderstanding. "They'll figure it out soon enough," he told himself as he switched off his bedroom light. "It's clearly my property. No one would seriously think otherwise." He drifted off to sleep, completely unaware of the battle that was brewing. 3 weeks after moving in, Thomas returned from grocery shopping to find two unfamiliar lawn chairs positioned in his driveway. A middle-aged couple he'd never met was enjoying drinks and chatting as if they were at a park. Thomas parked on the street and approached them with confusion. "Excuse me, but you're sitting in my driveway," he said, trying to sound polite. The woman looked surprised. "Oh, this is the community leisure area. Marjorie told us everyone uses this space." "I'm sorry, but this is my private property," Thomas explained. "It's not a community area." They apologized and left, but Thomas was baffled. Why would Marjorie tell him his driveway was public space? Thomas carried his groceries inside, still processing what had just happened. He put away the refrigerated items and then stepped back outside to examine his driveway more carefully. There was nothing about it that would suggest it was anything but private property. No signage, no special paving stones, nothing to indicate it served as a communal gathering spot. As he stood contemplating, his next-door neighbor Ryan came over. "Hey, I noticed some folks in your driveway earlier," Ryan said, leaning against the mailbox post. "First time it's happened since you moved in?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "They seemed convinced this was some kind of community area," said Marjorie told them so. Ryan grimaced. "Yeah, I was afraid of that. Look, here's something you should know about this place. The previous owners, the Hendersons, they had some kind of arrangement with Marjorie. They traveled a lot, and I guess they let her use the driveway for some HOA functions when they were gone. Nothing official, just a friendly agreement. But I never agreed to anything like that," Thomas protested. "Of course not. And you shouldn't have to," Ryan agreed. "But Marjorie, she tends to think once something becomes tradition, it becomes rule. Between you and me, she runs this place like her personal kingdom. That night, Thomas composed a polite but firm email to Marjorie, explaining the misunderstanding and clarifying that his driveway was not available for community use. He received no response. 2 days later, Thomas came home from work to find a small table set up in his driveway. An elderly woman he recognized from down the street was reading a book while sipping tea. "Good afternoon," he said, approaching her cautiously. "I'm Thomas, a homeowner." "Oh, hello, dear. I'm Mrs. Peterson. Lovely spot you have here," she replied cheerfully. "Thank you, but I'm afraid this is my private driveway, not a public area," Thomas explained as gently as possible. Mrs. Peterson looked genuinely confused, but Marjorie said, "She told me the circular driveways in the community are designated relaxation spots. I've been coming here every Tuesday for years." "I'm sorry for the confusion, but that information isn't correct. This is my property," Thomas insisted. Mrs. Peterson gathered her things, visibly embarrassed. "How mortifying. I had no idea I was trespassing. Marjorie specifically mentioned your address at the last HOA meeting as a prime spot for quiet contemplation. I should have known better than to trust that one." After helping Mrs. Peterson with her things, Thomas felt a mixture of frustration and resolve building within him. This wasn't a one-off misunderstanding. It was starting to look like a deliberate pattern. The question was why? What possible reason could Marjorie have for sending people to loiter on his property? Thomas decided it was time to attend the next HOA meeting and get to the bottom of this strange situation. The next day, Thomas knocked on Marjorie's door. When she answered, her pleasant smile quickly faded upon seeing him. "Marjorie, I had some people in my driveway yesterday who said you told them it was a community leisure area. There must be some misunderstanding." Marjorie's posture stiffened. "Well, that particular area has always been used by the community. The previous owners understood that. But it's my property," Thomas insisted. "It's not a public space." Actually, Section 7.34 of the HOA guidelines states that certain areas designated for community use must remain accessible, she retorted, crossing her arms. Thomas went home and scoured the binder. No such section existed. The following morning, Thomas reviewed the HOA guidelines one more time, making absolutely certain he hadn't missed anything. The binder was meticulously organized with tabs separating different categories of rules. He checked the index, the appendices, even the fine print at the bottom of each page. There was simply no Section 7.34 and nothing about community use of private driveways anywhere in the document. Frustrated but determined, Thomas decided to seek a second opinion. He texted Ryan, inviting him over for coffee. "I've gone through this entire binder twice," Thomas told him, spreading the HOA guidelines across his kitchen table. "There's nothing here about driveways being community spaces. Nothing about Section 7.34 either." Ryan flipped through a few pages, frowning. "That's because it doesn't exist. Look, I've lived here for 5 years. Marjorie makes up rules when it suits her agenda. But why my driveway? What's so special about it?" Ryan hesitated before answering. "The layout of your property is unique in the neighborhood. That circular driveway with the garden island is like a ready-made gathering spot. The Hendersons were hardly ever here, so Marjorie got used to utilizing the space. When they decided to sell, rumor has it Marjorie tried to influence who would buy the house. Thomas digested this information. So she's upset that I bought it instead of whoever she wanted." "Possibly," Ryan nodded. "But here's what you need to know. Marjorie's son-in-law is on the city council. Her daughter works for the largest real estate company in the area. They have connections and are not about using them." After Ryan left, Thomas decided it was time for a more direct approach. He drove to the community center where he knew Marjorie volunteered on Thursdays. He found her in the office organizing flyers for an upcoming HOA event. "Marjorie," Thomas said, placing his copy of the HOA guidelines on her desk. "I've reviewed every page of this document. There is no Section 7.34 and there's nothing about private driveways being designated as community spaces." Marjorie didn't look up from her task. "The community accessibility clause is in the supplementary guidelines. You clearly haven't received the complete documentation. Then I'd like to see these supplementary guidelines, please. They're only available to board members," she replied dismissively. "But rest assured, they exist." "If they exist and apply to homeowners, we all have a right to see them," Thomas countered. "Otherwise, they can't be enforceable." Marjorie finally looked up, her eyes cold. "Mr. Chen, I've managed this community for 15 years. I know every rule, written and unwritten. Your property has a designated community area. That's been established by precedent and community understanding." "Precedent doesn't override my property rights," Thomas said firmly. "Unless you can show me documentation that I legally agreed to when purchasing the house, I'm going to have to insist that you stop telling people to use my driveway." "We'll see about that," Marjorie replied, a tight smile forming on her lips. This community has ways of dealing with uncooperative residents. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas found more strangers using his driveway, lawn chairs, picnic blankets, and once even a small birthday celebration. Each time, he politely but firmly asked them to leave, explaining it was private property. Each person claimed Marjorie had directed them there. Finally, Thomas installed a simple private property sign at the entrance to his driveway. The next morning, he found it removed and a citation from the HOA in his mailbox for unauthorized signage. The fine was $150. When he called a community board meeting to address the issue, only 3 other homeowners showed up besides Marjorie, who brought printouts of historical neighborhood usage patterns, showing that his driveway had supposedly been used for community gatherings for years. Thomas stared in disbelief at the citation. The fine seemed excessive, especially for a simple sign stating the obvious. He took photos of the empty sign posts and the citation before heading to work, his mind racing with possible solutions to this escalating problem. That evening, he received a series of text messages from Ryan. Heads up, the first one read, Marjorie's been going door to door telling everyone you're trying to privatize community spaces and destroy neighborhood traditions. Another text followed. Also, they're planning something for this weekend. I overheard Marjorie's daughter talking about a community appreciation gathering at your address on Saturday afternoon. Thomas thanked Ryan for the warning and immediately sent an email to the entire HOA board, formally requesting that they address the issue of trespassing on his property. He received only one response from Marjorie herself, stating that his concerns would be added to the agenda for next month's meeting. Saturday morning arrived and Thomas was prepared. He set up his own lawn chair at the entrance to his driveway and worked on his laptop a copy of his property deed and the HOA guidelines on the small table beside him. Around 1 p.m., cars began arriving. Marjorie led a group of about 15 residents, all carrying folding chairs, coolers, and picnic baskets. Excuse me, Thomas said, standing to address the group. I appreciate that you all may have been told this is a community space, but this is my private property. I have not given permission for any gathering here today. This is ridiculous, Marjorie announced to the group. This area has been used for community functions for over a decade. He's trying to break community traditions. An older man from the group stepped forward. Is that true, young man? The Hendersons always allowed us to use this space. The Hendersons may have made personal arrangements with certain neighbors. Thomas explained calmly that those arrangements weren't legally binding to future homeowners. I purchased this property with no easements or special conditions attached. He held up his deed. This driveway is legally part of my private property. Several people in the group looked uncomfortable, glancing between Thomas and Marjorie. Furthermore, Thomas continued, I've received this citation for putting up a private property sign, which I only installed after repeated trespassing incidents. He held up the citation. I'm contesting this fine as it violates my rights as a property owner. He's being completely unreasonable, Marjorie insisted, her voice rising. The HOA has designated this space. Show them the documentation, Marjorie, Thomas interrupted. Show them section 7.34 that you mentioned to me. The crowd turned expectantly to Marjorie, whose face flushed red. I don't have it with me right now, she stammered, but it exists. I've spoken with 3 former board members this week, Thomas replied. None of them recall such a provision nor any formal agreement regarding my driveway. The gathering began to disperse, May apologizing to Thomas as they left, but Marjorie remained, her eyes cold with anger. This isn't over, she said quietly. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, Thomas received 3 more citations in his mailbox for landscape violations, improper waste container placement, and unauthorized exterior modifications. Thomas began documenting everything. He set up a security camera overlooking his driveway and recorded every instance of trespassing. He took screenshots of the HOA bylaws proving no such community space designation existed. He gathered testimonials from neighbors who confirmed the previous owners had never allowed public use of their driveway. He also discovered that Marjorie's daughter had once tried to buy his house but lost the bidding war to Thomas. This revelation suddenly made Marjorie's hostility make sense. With his evidence organized, Thomas consulted a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. The lawyer confirmed that Marjorie was clearly overstepping her authority. The lawyer, Sandra Martinez, reviewed Thomas' growing file of evidence with interest. This is one of the more blatant cases of HOA overreach I've seen, she said, adjusting her glasses as she examined the video footage of strangers repeatedly entering his property. And these retaliatory citations are particularly concerning. Can they really fine me for these alleged violations? Thomas asked, spreading out the collection of citations that now totaled over $500. They can try, Sandra replied, but they're on shaky legal ground. First, let's address these citations. I'll draft a formal letter contesting each one. As they worked through his documentation, Sandra paused at a particular email. "You said you found this in the HOA's public records." Thomas nodded. "They're required to maintain minutes of all meetings. I requested everything from the past year." The email was from Marjorie to her daughter, accidentally included in the board's communication records. It clearly stated, "Don't worry about losing the Chen house. Once we make it unbearable for him, he'll sell quickly, and we can ensure you get it below market value." "This is a smoking gun," Sandra said. "Clear evidence of harassment and potential real estate fraud." Over the next week, Thomas expanded his investigation. He interviewed Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had been using his driveway. She revealed that Marjorie had specifically directed seniors to Thomas' property, calling it the new community relaxation station at their monthly seniors club meeting. Ryan helped Thomas connect with the Hendersons, the previous owners, via video call. They were shocked to hear what was happening. "We never had any agreement about community use," Mr. Henderson explained. "We did let Marjorie host one HOA summer party in our driveway 5 years ago when the community center was being renovated, but that was a one-time courtesy." Mrs. Henderson added Marjorie did approach us several times about making it a permanent arrangement, but we always declined. When we decided to sell, she became quite pushy about wanting her daughter to buy the house. Thomas's security cameras captured multiple incidents. Marjorie herself removing a second private property sign, a group arriving with folding tables and chairs only to leave when confronted with the camera, and most damning of all, Marjorie directing a landscaping crew to enter his property to trim communal bushes without permission. Thomas compiled all this evidence into a comprehensive dossier, complete with a timeline of events, photographic evidence, video recordings, witness statements, and official property documents. Sandra helped him organize it for maximum impact, adding relevant state laws and legal precedents regarding property rights and HOA limitations. "This is more than enough to put a stop to the harassment," Sandra assured him. "But I suspect you want more than just to be left alone at this point." Thomas nodded, his resolve strengthened by weeks of stress and frustration. "This isn't just about my driveway anymore. It's about abuse of power. How many other homeowners has she bullied like this?" "Well," Sandra said with a slight smile, "I think it's time we called a special community meeting." At the next full community meeting, Thomas came prepared. When Marjorie attempted to skip over his agenda item, he stood up and respectfully requested his time to speak. "I've lived here for 2 months now, and I've had my property repeatedly trespassed upon under the direction of our HOA president," he began, connecting his laptop to the projector. For the next 15 minutes, he methodically presented his evidence, video clips of strangers in his driveway citing Marjorie's permission, the fabricated HOA rules she had referenced, testimonials from other residents, and finally, the connection to Marjorie's daughter's failed attempt to purchase his home. The room fell silent as he finished. Other homeowners began expressing their concerns about Marjorie's leadership. Some shared their own stories of questionable HOA enforcement. The community center meeting room was unusually packed that evening. Word had spread about Thomas' presentation, and nearly every household in Willow Creek Estates was represented. Marjorie sat at the head table with the other board members, her expression stony as Thomas connected his laptop to the projector. "Before Mr. Chen begins," Marjorie interrupted, "I want to remind everyone that personal disputes should be handled privately, not at community meetings." The HOA vice president, a retired professor named Dr. Winters, cleared his throat. "Actually, Marjorie, this item was properly submitted according to our bylaws. Mr. Chen has the floor for 15 minutes. Thomas nodded gratefully and launched into his presentation. He started with his property deed and the official plot map, highlighting the clear boundaries of his land. He then played a compilation of security footage showing various residents setting up furniture in his driveway, followed by clips of him politely asking them to leave. "Each of these individuals told me the same thing," Thomas explained, "that our HOA president, Ms. Hoffman, had directed them to use my driveway as a community space." Murmurs spread through the room as Thomas displayed the HOA guidelines side by side with Marjorie's email, citing the non-existent section 7.34. "I've interviewed 6 former board members," Thomas continued, "and none recall any such provision or community designation for my property." The most impactful moment came when Thomas played the video call with the Hendersons. The former owners' confused expressions as they denied any permanent arrangement for community use of their driveway generated audible gasps. Finally, Thomas displayed the incriminating email from Marjorie to her daughter. As he read it aloud, "Once we make it unbearable for him, he'll sell quickly, and we can ensure you get it below market value." The room erupted in shocked conversations. "This isn't just about my driveway," Thomas concluded. "This is about abuse of power and using HOA authority for personal gain." Marjorie shot to her feet. "This is slander. That email is taken completely out of context, and the Hendersons clearly don't remember our arrangement correctly." Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up shakily. Marjorie, you specifically told our seniors group to use his driveway. You called it the Community Relaxation Station and said it was officially designated for public use. I feel horrible now knowing I was trespassing on this young man's property because of your lies. One by one, other homeowners began standing to share similar experiences. You fined me $300 for planting unauthorized flowers, but when I asked to see the approved plant list, you said it was bored eyes only. You told me I needed special permission to paint my door navy blue and charged me a $150 color review fee that went straight to you. You had my basketball hoop removed while we were on vacation, claiming it violated height restrictions that don't exist in our guidelines. As the testimonies mounted, Marjorie's face grew increasingly flushed. She repeatedly tried to call for order, but the dam had broken. Years of frustration poured out from the community she had ruled over. After Thomas's presentation, the community called for an emergency vote and removed Marjorie from her position as HOA president. A new board was elected with a commitment to transparency and proper governance. Thomas's private property sign was officially approved, and he received a formal apology from the new board. Marjorie, humiliated by the exposure, put her house on the market 2 months later. As for Thomas, he eventually became known for hosting actual community gatherings by invitation only, where his infamous driveway became a symbol of his victory over HOA overreach. The new neighbors who moved into Marjorie's old house became some of his closest friends in the neighborhood, and together they worked to create a more respectful, honest community at Willow Creek Estates. The evening of the community meeting ended with unprecedented action. Dr. Winters called for an immediate vote of no confidence in Marjorie's leadership, citing the HOA bylaws that allowed for emergency removal of board members in cases of misconduct. The vote was nearly unanimous, with only Marjorie's sister-in-law and one loyal friend voting against it. This meeting is out of order, Marjorie shouted as Dr. Winters took over. You can't do this. Actually, we can, replied Diane Rodriguez, a homeowner who happened to be a paralegal. Article 12, Section 3 of our bylaws specifically allows for immediate removal in cases of fraud, misrepresentation, or abuse of authority. I'd say you fit the trifecta. The following week, an interim board was established while plans were made for formal elections. Their first order of business was to audit the HOA's financial records, revealing several questionable transactions that had benefited Marjorie's family members, including consulting fees paid to her daughter's design company for unnecessary community center renovations. Thomas received a hand-delivered letter from the interim board containing a formal apology and the cancellation of all his citations. His private property sign was officially approved, and the board issued a community-wide clarification that his driveway was indeed private property. The real estate attorney, Sandra Martinez, helped the new board draft clearer guidelines and establish proper procedures for rule enforcement. She also assisted several homeowners, including Thomas, in filing small claims cases to recover unjust fees they had paid under Marjorie's reign. For Marjorie, the fallout was swift and severe. Beyond losing her position of authority, she faced social ostracism from neighbors who now recognized her years of manipulation. Within 2 months, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. Good riddance, Ryan told Thomas as they watched the moving truckload Marjorie's furniture. That woman made everyone's lives miserable for years, but nobody had the courage to stand up to her until you came along. That summer, as a gesture of goodwill and closure, Thomas decided to host a proper neighborhood gathering by invitation only in his driveway. He set up strings of lights around the garden island, brought out his grill, and invited everyone on the block, including Dr. Winters and the other new board members. To new beginnings, Thomas toasted, raising his glass as neighbors gathered around. And to knowing the difference between community spirit and community overreach. The gathering became a quarterly tradition, cementing Thomas' reputation not as the homeowner who fought the HOA, but as the catalyst who helped restore balance and fairness to Willow Creek Estates. The following year, a young couple purchased Marjorie's old house. Emily and David Peterson, no relation to the elderly Mrs. Peterson, quickly became friends with Thomas, often joining him for weekend barbecues. We heard about the infamous driveway battle before we even moved in, Emily told Thomas one evening. The realtor actually used it as a selling point, said the neighborhood had recently overthrown a dictator and established democracy. Thomas laughed. That's overstating it a bit. Not really, David replied. Standing up to everyday injustice takes courage. Sometimes the smallest battles have the biggest impact. As years passed, the driveway incident became neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale about power and accountability. The garden island in Thomas's driveway, once the center of conflict, flourished with perennials and became known as Freedom's Circle, a private space that symbolized the importance of respecting boundaries, both personal and property.